In just 8 minutes, get the key takeaways from Tim Miller's explosive interview with Ben Wittes on the Bulwark, posted on February 26, 2025. From government chaos and FBI shakeups to shocking Ukraine revelations, this summary cuts through the noise to bring you the most crucial insights. Stay till the end. You won't believe what's really happening. Here are the key takeaways from the interview. Takeaway 1, nobody knows who runs DOGE. One of the strangest and most concerning issues raised in the podcast is that no one seems to know who is actually running DOGE, an entity that appears to be making important decisions within the federal government. When asked in court, the Justice Department could not provide a clear answer. This has real consequences because if no one officially leads DOGE, then its legitimacy cannot be challenged or reviewed under the law. Judge Colleen Collar-Cotelli, a respected district judge in Washington, D.C., pointed out that knowing who is in charge is essential. Without this information, there is no way to determine if DOGE is acting within legal limits. This confusion makes it difficult to hold anyone accountable for major decisions, including funding cuts and policy shifts. For example, imagine showing up to a business meeting and asking, "Who's the CEO?" only to have everyone look around awkwardly and say, we're not sure, but someone keeps sending emails telling us what to do." That is the level of absurdity surrounding DOGE. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 2, firing people may cost more than keeping them. The administration has fired thousands of government employees, from forest rangers and researchers to Justice Department lawyers. However, many of these people have legal protections against wrongful termination, meaning they can sue to get their jobs back. The government is likely to lose many of these cases, forcing taxpayers to cover back wages for people who were unfairly dismissed. This situation is particularly ridiculous because most of these employees have already moved on to other jobs. When they win their lawsuits, the government will have to pay them for work they never did. In the end, the administration will have spent millions of dollars on legal battles without actually reducing costs. For example, imagine you cancel your gym membership, but months later, the gym sues you and forces you to pay for all the time you were not using their equipment. That is basically what is happening here. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 3, the FBI is being reshaped from the top down. The appointment of Kash and Dan Bongino to leadership positions in the FBI has alarmed career officials. Patel has been accused of lying about his involvement in personnel changes, while Bongino, a right-wing podcaster with no FBI experience, is now in a top management role. These moves suggest an effort to politicize the Bureau and push out those investigating key cases like January 6th. Typically, the FBI's deputy director is a highly experienced agent who has spent decades in the agency. Instead, the position is now held by someone whose main qualification is yelling on his podcast. Many current FBI agents fear this will damage the Bureau's professionalism and independence. For example, this is like putting a guy who spent years ranting about referees in charge of the NBA and then being shocked when the game turns into chaos. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 4, the administration is making legal defenses out of thin air. When Trump or his allies make drastic decisions, legal teams have to scramble to justify them. Lawyers take bizarre executive orders and turn them into complex legal arguments, even when the orders seem to have been written hastily or without real authority. This makes it difficult for courts to take these arguments seriously. For example, it is like a student turning in a half-page essay written in crayon and then hiring a team of top professors to argue that it deserves an A+. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 5, the government is blocking aid for no clear reason. In some cases, funding for crucial programs like aid to Ukraine and global health initiatives has been stopped by DOGE employees. Even when agency leaders approve the payments, DOGE staff members veto them. This has left humanitarian efforts in limbo, including funding for AIDS clinics in Africa. For example, it is like a boss approving your paycheck, but then a random intern decides you should not be paid, and nobody can explain why. We're halfway through the video. Thank you for sticking with us this far. If you're enjoying it, please give us a thumbs up and share it in your WhatsApp groups. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment below. To see more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Now let's continue with the video. Takeaway 6. The administration is making the press a target. U.S. Attorney Ed Martin has publicly attacked the Associated Press for not calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, reflecting an attempt to control media language. These types of intimidation tactics raise concerns about press freedom and government overreach. For example, it is like a school principal threatening detention if students refuse to call pizza freedom flatbread. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 7. Political intimidation is growing. There is increasing concern that threats against political opponents are not being taken seriously. A bomb threat at a conference attended by Never Trump Republicans and Capitol Police officers was barely investigated. This lack of response creates an environment where political intimidation becomes normalized. For example, imagine if someone threatened to burn down a store, but the police just said, "Well, we'll get to it later," and then went to ticket people for jaywalking instead. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 8, US-Ukraine relations have had a complicated history. A new podcast, Escalation, explores the history of US-Ukraine relations. One example from the first episode is the Chicken Kyiv speech by President George H.W. Bush in 1991, where he warned Ukrainians against nationalism, appearing to support Soviet leadership. Many Ukrainians saw this as the U.S. siding with Moscow. For example, it was like showing up at a wedding and telling the bride she should probably stay with her ex, not the message people wanted to hear. Now let's move to the next takeaway. Takeaway 9, Ukrainians are uniting in response to Trump's attacks. Despite internal divisions, Ukrainians are rallying around President Zelensky after Trump's recent attacks on him. Even Zelensky's critics within Ukraine are pushing back against Trump's claims, emphasizing that only Ukrainians have the right to criticize their own leader. For example, it is like siblings who argue all the time, but will still defend each other if an outsider tries to pick a fight. Now let's move to the last takeaway. Takeaway 10. The U.S. may be abandoning Ukraine. For years, the U.S. and Ukraine worked as strategic partners against Russian aggression. But recent actions, such as voting against Ukraine at the UN and halting military aid, signal a major shift in policy. Europe does not have the production capacity to replace U.S. support, leaving Ukraine in a vulnerable position. For example, it is like a team in a championship game where the coach suddenly walks off the field and starts cheering for the other team. If you're interested in learning more about these topics, I encourage you to watch the full interview on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description below. If you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like below and share this video in your WhatsApp groups. You can also discuss about this video by commenting below. To get more such videos in your timeline, press the subscribe button below.